Following the fusion process, the cells were placed in an activation medium. Under chemical stimulation, each gamete that had been ready for fertilization prior to the removal of its DNA now worked magic with its adopted full complement of chromosomes. Following a mysterious molecular mechanism, the adult nuclei forsook their previous epithelial duties and reverted to their embryonic roles. After a short period of time, each gamete began to divide to form individual embryos that would soon be ready for implantation. The donor of the adult cells had been cloned. In fact, he'd been cloned approximately 60 times. April 6, 1999. "Are you comfortable?" Dr. Paul Saunders asked his patient, Kristen Overmeyer, who lay on the aged operating table clothed only in a backless hospital johnny. "I guess," Kristen answered, although she was not comfortable at all. Medical environments never fail to evoke anxiety in her, and the present room was particularly disagreeable. It was an ancient operating theater. Its walls were bile green, cracked tile with dark splotches, presumably from old blood staining the grout. It looked more like a scene in a Gothic horror movie than a room currently in use. There were also tiers of observation seats that disappeared up into the gloom, beyond the reach of the overhead surgical light. Thankfully, the seats were all empty. "I guess doesn't sound too convincing," Dr. Sheila Donaldson said from the opposite side of the operating table, opposite Dr. Saunders. She smiled down at the patient, although the only observable effect was a crinkling at the corners of her eyes. The rest of her face was hidden behind her surgical mask and hood. "I wish this was over," Kristen managed. At that moment, she wished she hadn't volunteered for the donation. The money would provide her with a degree of financial freedom that few of her fellow Harvard students enjoyed, but that seemed less important now. Her only consolation was that she knew she'd soon be asleep. When she'd been offered the choice of general anesthesia or local, she'd chosen the former without a moment's hesitation. The last thing she wanted to be was awake, while they pushed a foot-long aspiration needle into her belly. "I trust we are going to be able to get this done today," Paul said to Dr. Carl Smith, the anesthesiologist. Paul had a lot to do that day, and had only scheduled 40 minutes for the procedure. He couldn't begin until Carl had the patient under, and minutes were inexorably ticking away. Carl didn't respond. Paul was always in a hurry. Satisfied with the oscillatory sounds he heard through his earpiece, Carl reached over and pulled his anesthesia machine closer to Kristen's head. All was ready. "Okay, Kristen," Carl said. "As I explained to you earlier, I'm going to give you a bit of milk of amnesia. Are you ready?" "Yes." "Have a good little sleep. The next time I'll be talking with you, we'll be in the recovery area." Such was Carl's usual comment to his patient just before beginning anesthesia, and indeed it was the usual course of events. But on this occasion, it was not to be. Blithely unaware that disaster was imminent, Carl reached for the IV line where he had the anesthetic agent piggybacked. With practiced ease, he gave the patient a predetermined amount based on her weight, but on the low end of the recommended dosage. It was the Wingate Infertility Clinic's policy for outpatient anesthesia to use the least amount appropriate of any particular drug. The goal was to ensure the patient's same-day discharge, since the clinic's inpatient facilities were limited. As the induction dose of propofol entered Kristen's body, Carl dutifully watched and listened to his monitoring devices. All seemed in order. Sheila chuckled beneath her mask. Milk of amnesia was Carl's humorous sobriquet for the anesthetic agent propofol, which was dispensed as a white liquid, and the term never failed to tickle her funny bone. "Can we start?" Paul knew he couldn't begin yet, but he wanted to communicate his impatience and displeasure. They shouldn't have called him until all was ready. Continuing to ignore Paul's peevishness, Carl concentrated on testing Kristen's level of consciousness. Satisfied she'd reached an appropriate state, he injected the muscle relaxant mivacurium. When the mivacurium had taken effect, he skillfully slipped in an endotracheal tube to ensure control of Kristen's airway. Then he sat down, attached the anesthesia machine, and motioned to Paul that everything was set. "It's about time." He and Sheila quickly draped the patient for laparoscopy. The target was the right ovary. Carl settled back to watch his monitors while maintaining anesthesia. Paul moved quickly, with Sheila anticipating his every move. Along with Constance Bartolo, the scrub nurse, and Marjorie Hickam, the circulator, the team worked with metronomic efficiency. Paul's first goal was to introduce the trocar of the insufflation unit to fill the patient's abdominal cavity with gas. It was the creation of a gas-filled space that made the laparoscopic surgery possible. Paul made a small incision at the umbilicus and then proceeded to push in the nearly foot-long Varese insufflation needle. 2 distinct pops could be felt as the needle passed into the abdominal cavity. Paul then activated the insufflation unit. Instantly, carbon dioxide gas began to flow into Kristen's abdominal cavity. As they waited for the appropriate amount of gas to enter, disaster struck. Carl was preoccupied, watching his cardiovascular and respiratory monitors, and failed to see 2 seemingly innocuous events, namely, a fluttering of Kristen's eyelids and a slight flexion of her left leg. Had Carl or anyone else noticed these movements, they would have sensed that Kristen's level of anesthesia was becoming light. She was still unconscious, but the discomfort of the increasing pressure in her belly was serving to rouse her. Suddenly, Kristen moaned and sat up. She didn't get all the way up because Carl reacted by reflex, grabbing her shoulders and forcing her back down. But it was too late. Her rising forced the Varese needle to plunge deeper into her belly, where it penetrated a large intra-abdominal vein. Before Paul could stop the insufflation unit, a large bolus of the gas entered Kristen's vascular system. "Oh, my God!" Carl cried, as he heard in his earpiece the beginnings of the ominous telltale mill-wheel murmur as the gas reached her heart. "We've got a gas embolism. Get her on her left side." Paul yanked out the bloody needle. He helped Carl roll Kristen over in a vain attempt to keep the gas isolated in the right side of her heart. Paul then leaned on her to keep her in position. Although still unconscious, she fought back. Carl rushed to insert a catheter into Kristen's jugular vein. At last he succeeded, but when he drew back on the plunger of the syringe, all he got was a bloody froth. He shook his head in dismay, but before he could say anything, Kristen briefly stiffened, then convulsed. Frantically, Carl dealt with this new problem while he battled the sinking feeling in his own gut. He knew all too well that anesthesiology was a profession marked by numbing repetitive routine, occasionally shattered by episodes of pure terror. And this was as bad as it got. A major complication with a young, healthy person undergoing a purely elective procedure. Both Paul and Sheila had stepped back. Along with the 2 nurses, they watched as Carl struggled to terminate Kristen's seizure. When it was over, Paul said, "What's the verdict?" Reluctantly, Carl pulled back Kristen's eyelids. Both pupils were widely dilated and did not react to the brightness of the overhead light. He took his penlight from his pocket and shined the beam into Kristen's eyes. There was no reaction whatsoever. "It doesn't look good." "Meaning?" Carl swallowed. "Meaning my guess would be that she's stroked out. She's not even breathing on her own." Paul snapped off his gloves. He looked at Sheila. "Why don't you continue with the procedure? At least you'll get some practice. And do both sides." "Really?" "No sense being wasteful." "What are you going to do?" Sheila asked. "I'm going to find Kurt Herman and have a chat." Paul pulled off his gown. "As unfortunate as this incident is, at least we've planned for it." "Are you going to inform Spencer Wingate?" Sheila asked. Dr. Wingate was the founder and titular head of the clinic. "I prefer to hold off and see how events play out. What do you know about Kristen Overmeyer's arrival today?" "She came by her own car. It's out in the parking lot." "She came alone?" "No. As we advised her, she brought a friend. Her name is Rebecca Corey. She's out in the main waiting area."